I'm Lois Donnelly, interviewing Professor Rose Capdevila on 12th of January 2022 on Zoom. And we're discussing her life and career in the context of feminism and its history within psychology. So first of all, I suppose, could you tell me a bit about yourself? So maybe a bit about, your career trajectory and kind of the topics of your work and that kind of thing.
Sure. Well, okay. This might be a little bit, not quite sure what to focus on. Okay. So I started in academia. I started out in a mix of different things. So I actually was accepted to university in engineering, and then I switched to physics, and then I switched to philosophy. And anyway, I ended up getting a degree in politics and psychology from the University of Toronto. And then I went to Spain to study Hispanic studies at the University of Barcelona for a few years. Mm-hmm. And I ended up working there for a while. And then I was working in business. And then I came to do a PhD in the UK at the University of Reading, mm-hmm. With Rex Tate and Rogers.
Yeah.
And I did that one in political psychology. My PhD was on women's involvement in single issue movements. So not gender related politics, but grassroots politics, mm-hmm. Which was what I was most interested in at the time. So I spoke to women involved in the Irish Republican movement, women involved in environmentalist protest, and women from the Countryside Alliance, and women in Oxfam. So it was just I tried to get an interesting mix of how different women. And there was a consistent theme through them, really interestingly. There was a consistent discourse around mothering, whether my participants were parents or weren't parents, or wanted to be parents or weren't, often used mothering discourses to explain their choices, their decisions, or how they positioned themselves. So it was a real drawing on that kind of discourse, which I maybe should have been expecting, but I wasn't. So I was really caught out by that. And that kind of made me interested in those mothering discourses.
Yeah.
So when I finished my PhD at the University of Reading, I got a job at Northampton. And while I was there, I started doing some research around advice, parenting advice. By that time, I had had 2 children. And with some colleagues, Sally Johnson and Jane Callahan, we started talking about the way advice was given to mothers and kind of the diversity, the complexity, the nuance, the changeability. So we started looking into that and eventually did some research around mothering and choice, primarily with Sally Johnson, around the MMR vaccine. So we moved kind of, so that mothering stream kind of went there, kind of into health psychology. Yeah. And in 2009, I moved to the Open University, which is where I'm currently, and I have been since then. And my research kind of was drawing still on kind of political activism, still kind of on mothering bits and pieces. And then in about 2012, 2013, the whole kind of selfies thing was happening. And that really caught my attention, and also that of my colleague, Lisa Lazard, who I do a lot of research with. And so we started doing work on that around gender discourse and social media. So most of my work since then has been focused on that, on gender and social media in digital spaces, around mothering, around young women, around how families use social media. And then, of course, I have my kind of parallel work, which has been around kind of POWES, around activism, and around kind of the history of feminist psychology and of psychology, which is something I've always been interested in, kind of where ideas come from.
Yeah.
And how they develop. So.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, such like an interesting flow to kind of slightly different things. So what first attracted you to psychology then? How did that go about?
That's really interesting. So I wasn't all that attracted to psychology, to be honest, at first. I mean, I kind of did it as an undergraduate. My main subject was politics, political theory. And I also did, as part of that, I did psychology and history and philosophy, kind of backing it up, because it's a 4-year degree in Canada. Right. And But when I wanted to do my PhD and I wanted to do women in social movements, I wanted to do women in politics, definitely.
Right.
And I was looking around for where to do it. And I came across Rex Stainton Rogers, who I had, whose work I had seen and who I'd run into kind of through the Autonomous University of Barcelona, where I knew some people. And he just seemed like a great supervisor for my work, but he was actually in social psychology at the University of Reading. So he was in the psychology department. So that's why I went to the psychology department to do my PhD. In talking to him about kind of my aspirations, about my research, he said, "Oh yeah, you could absolutely do that in psychology," which I had always conceived of as a politics topic. Yeah.
Mm.
And that was great. And and then once I was in psychology, I really loved, and I still do, and I tell my students this all the time, I love the way psychology is relevant to everything.
Mm.
Yeah, just everything that you're studying, psychology can have some kind of intervention or is relevant in some kind of way. So it really is a study of everything.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I totally agree. Yeah. So it was more kind of, I suppose, the person then and the topic that led you to psychology rather than.
Yeah. But I was happy when I found myself there.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And so in the same vein of kind of those things developing then, how did kind of you were saying you're really interested in kind of women in politics. How did your kind of feminist identity develop, or like how did kind of feminism come into that?
Yeah, so that came to me later in life than I think probably it should have. Mm. I think I was very I was very much embedded in a kind of neoliberal egalitarian discourse for a large part of my life. You know, even though it was a very left-wing one and a very communitarian one, it still followed that kind of individual achievement narrative. Mm-hmm. So where I was, aware of sexism, no question about that, I wasn't really involved in feminist politics per se. I was involved in politics. And I think that this is a history for a lot of people in a lot of cultural contexts. At that point, I was living in Spain. In Catalonia. So I think really, I thought very much of feminism as a political position, which, was there. Mm. But my politics were more kind of left-wing politics, rather than gendered or identity politics, I guess, in a sense. But when I came to the UK and I was studying, and obviously I was studying a topic that was very gender related, which was on gender. Obviously, I started reading literature, and then what I fell in love with was feminist theory. Mm. And I know there are lots of feminist theories, but what I love about that kind of work, people like Donna Haraway and Judith Butler, loved Valerie Walkerdine. I loved the way it conceptualized the similarities and differences. I know that sounds really basic, but it's still, I loved that way of thinking about how things belong and don't belong. So that I became very interested in thinking about things like that. And then I became involved in POWES, to be fair. It's one of the first conferences I ever went to. It was like the end of my first year of my PhD. I'm not quite sure how. I think Erica Berman told me about it, actually. Who was someone I had met, but hadn't actually, knew very much about her work at that point yet. Yeah. And so I went to the POWES conference all by myself, and it was a really interesting, I was befriended by lovely Geraldine Moan, who kind of took pity on me and let me join her groups, and just started hearing really, really interesting discussions and debates and the way things were being considered and thought about. And again, that real notion of sameness and difference and boundaries that my research was about, that I've always cared about, how things are of us and not of us, which obviously social psychology is, very much what it does. So I found that really, really interesting. And that's where I met, lots of people that are in POWES and have been since. I mean, that first year, they had talks from, Paula Nicholson and Jane Usher and Celia Kitzinger and Sue Wilkinson and Erica Berman did a talk, and so it was just like, oh my God, when you get that that research where it's that somebody who's saying in POWES, it's like being in a room with your reading list, and it was very much that feeling of being in a room with your reading list. All these people that you want to read and know about, and there they are sitting beside you, and oh my God, what do you say? So.
Yeah. Oh, that's weird for me to hear that you could feel like that, because it's kind of the same for us in a way as well. But yeah, so how did you come across Erica Berman then? Like, how did you cross paths with her then the first time?
Oh, that was a complicated history about. So my partner was a social psychologist at the time, and so he had been doing work with Ian Parker and Erica Berman, and also with Rex Staten Rogers and Wendy Staten Rogers and the Beryl Kirk group, which I was first. So early on in my career as a PhD student, I engaged with the Beryl Kirk group, which was a group of academics at mostly at Reading, but Reading at the OU, led by Rex Staten Rogers and Wendy Staten Rogers, and they included people like Paul Stenner and Steve Brown, Carol Owens. There's more people that are now Marcia Worrell, Lindsay Odell. So those are the kind of people that I first started working with, and they had been doing books. They did a fantastic book called Textuality and Tectonics, which is probably out of print, but it's a lovely kind of consideration of how discourse works and text works in the everyday. So and they'd done different kinds of work. So I got involved with that group, and we had regular meetings and we read, and that was great. That was such an inspiration. I used to sit and afraid of what I could say in those meetings, be just terrified where everyone spoke clever. So that was, but really, unfortunately, my PhD supervisor, Rex, passed away just as I had started writing up my PhD. And so in those days, you only had one supervisor. So it was a bit of a, and Reading, to their credit, said, just find yourself someone to, kind of supervise the rest of your PhD. And Erica Berman very kindly agreed. I mean, at the time, I had no idea what it was to take on somebody's PhD thesis that late in the process. But Erica did it, and it was wonderful. I mean, they were both, I was really lucky. I had two exceptional supervisors, and which is probably why I believe in mentorship so much, but really supervisors who really pushed me, and didn't push me to be like them, but pushed me to think about things and move forward and consider things in different kinds of ways. And then Erica, of course, where I'd been reading around feminism, Erica obviously had, quite a pedigree in feminist thought. So she was able to direct me a little bit more in a more targeted way towards the kind of work that related more specifically to kind of the work I was doing. And that was great. And Erica was wonderful. After I finished my PhD, she included me in symposiums and invited me to talk at her university. And she's always been supportive. I mean, she wrote a reference for me, last year. So she's, yeah. So, yeah. So it's a good community. I think the POWES community is really, really made a big difference to the way my career has gone, and I think to the way psychology has gone in the UK. I think it's been a force for good in lots of ways.
Yeah, can you kind of unpack that a little bit and kind of tell me a bit more about how you think POWES has kind of influenced the field, maybe, or the area?
Well, I think there is an interesting thing. So I think that there was an interesting, I think it was a 20th anniversary, or certainly some anniversary like that, when Jan Burns came to speak, who's one of the founding members. And Jan was reflecting on how all these women who had kind of been the founding members of POWES, and it was like everyone was saying, you're throwing away your career, what, you're never going to do anything in psychology. At that point, we're all professors. Yeah. So it clearly become very successful. I mean, so I think they really brought that feminist work to the forefront. I think also not only kind of feminist POWES kind of contingency, but very importantly, the POWES contingency, kind of really pushed for a rethinking of methods and a reconsideration of methods, and kind of the use of qualitative methods and creative methods. And I think they brought that to the universities they were working at. I think they brought it to their practice, and I think they brought it to the BPS. the qualitative methods section, is the biggest section in the BPS. It went from nothing to pretty much from non-existing. It was established and it became, the biggest section almost immediately, because there are so many people interested in those approaches. And I think that's one of the important impacts that POWES has had. But, I think POWES has pushed on other agendas like sexuality. I know that, when the lesbian and gay section, which then became the sexuality section, I think is changing name now again. A lot of POWES members were involved in the formation of that, like they were in the qualitative section. So I think there's been a real push in that sense in thinking forward.
Yeah, so influenced kind of a range of things, really, not just feminism and psychology.
Yeah, the conceptualization of others, which is, I think, an important thing for feminists.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so after that first kind of, that first conference you went to, what was your involvement with POWES after that?
Well, it was, you've probably heard this story before. That first conference was it was really lovely for me, but there was an event that clearly brought many things to a head that had been happening in that space as a feminist space. And Erica Berman's written a chapter for it, actually, in a book that I edited with Alex Rutherford and Ingrid Palmari and Vineyard Duty on international feminisms. And in that book, Erica writes about British feminism in psychology, and she speaks of this. She actually presents the talk that she gave at that conference and kind of contextualizes it within what we're doing today. There was a bit, at the time, I had no idea what was going on. I mean, there was a whole group of us there watching, and then suddenly everyone was arguing on stage, and it was all like, oh my God, and everyone was being quite mean to each other. And a bunch of us were just sitting there, and a few people kind of put their hand up and went, excuse me, I understand that, there's something going on here, but I think there has to be some recognition that most of us out here have no idea what's going on. And it was, interestingly, and maybe this piqued my interest as well, the discussion was around the telling of the history of feminist psychology, which I think which is probably why since then I've had this kind of interest in trying to tell a story that that can be shared, that's a shared kind of narrative. But from that, there were a number of us at that meeting who spoke afterwards, and we're kind of like, this is not the space we want. We want a space where people behave with kindness, with respect.
Yeah.
And not a place where you're going to yell at you and you're frightened. It's a place of comfort, a place where we can come to. And so we joined the committee after that. So Karen Ciclatira was one of those people, and she had joined the committee. And then I joined the committee. She kind of suggested to me I might want to join. They were a person short or something. It was halfway through the term. So I joined. And lots of other people joined. And there was a concerted effort for a few years to make it a safe, what we now call a safe space. Nobody called it a space then, but to call it a space where people could come and feel comfortable. And it was mostly dominated by PhD. We were all PhD students at the time, and it had been founded by PhD students. So there was a kind of resonance around there, and we'd go to the conferences and we'd get together, and there was a real focus on being supportive in the way you engaged with people's presentations, and a real kind of welcoming of people's engagements with feminism that might not be the same as yours, but kind of listening to what they have to say and kind of going, okay, how about this? Have you thought about this? Rather than, why aren't you saying this? Which has been, and when somebody tries to, because every now and then somebody will try to do, why aren't you doing this at POW? Someone who doesn't know that, who's new or whatever. There's always the whole kind of group, kind of collective thing that kind of goes, oh, but let's say this nicely, which I think is a really important thing. I think creating POWES as a safe space was a really, really important move in kind of the history of the organization. And a real encouragement of early career people, because we were all early career people at the time. We were either PhD students or, shortly, or very early on. So I think there was a real wanting to make that space, and really supporting stuff like the POWES Student Prize. And, so I think, so there was a concerted effort to make it that kind of space. At the same time, I think it's really important that we don't, sometimes when we do this, like POWES as a feminist pen night, or POWES as a feminist summer camp kind of idea, because it has that feeling of camaraderie and kind of hominess that we know that it has. It's also really important to remember that it is a critical academic space, and it very much is a critical, and people are critical in their thinking, and their approaches to academia.
Yeah, definitely. And so in talking about kind of, that focus on early career people, do you think that it still has that kind of focus, and kind of early career people still engaging with POWES in the same way?
I don't think it's in the same way. And I think, but I do think it still happens. So I think it's not in the same way. Partly, the environment has changed. So when I was a PhD student, everyone was getting jobs before they finished their PhD. Like, they'd be writing up and everyone had lectureships. And so it was a particular moment, So I think there were more and more universities every day. All the old polytechnics had been turned into universities. Psychology wasn't as growing. So there were lots of jobs out there, and a lot of people were walking into lectureships, So and also there was no real pressure to publish while you were doing your PhD, like really not any. So it was a different experience then. But you immediately had a job, so you could go to your job and go to POWES, and you're much closer to the experience. So you were bringing your colleagues and people you work with, like you were doing your third year of your PhD, and then there was someone in their first year. By the time you got a job, they were in their third year. You'd go, come along. Also, the PhD period, most people took 4 years to do their PhD. Or 5, it's not, it wasn't unheard of. So I think, so I think it was a more relaxed academia at the time. And I think now we try really hard, but not as successfully as I would like, to encourage early career people. Having said that, I was chair of POWES in 2020 to 2021. And because of COVID, we had our online conference in 2021, and there were a number of early career PhD students who contacted me afterwards to say, oh, I found that a really encouraging space, thank you. I count me as chair, not for me making responsible. Sorry, I didn't want to take credit for that. I just they contact and have become involved. So a few of them have become involved in the committee, and are really enthusiastic about coming back. So I think we want to encourage more and more of that, definitely. So we have much cheaper rates for students. We always have bursaries for students. We run now writing retreats we've been doing for the last few years. We often have bursaries for students to do that. So we do very much have an agenda and kind of a focus on supporting young people. I'm not early career people. They don't have to be young people. They just have to be early career people. But also, we need to focus on, because there's many more mid-career feminists out there than there were as well. And also, I'm someone who have always had a lot of interest in people's kind of life narratives and then their history. So I always, I'm always suggesting we invite founding members back to speak at conferences, or we get them involved in some kind of element of the section.
Again, kind of bringing the history back, I suppose, into POWES again.
And bringing back people who have been away for a while. And I think we have a real inclusivity mentality, right, at POWES, and I think that's very much shared kind of a viewpoint of it. But and that's been throughout the years.
And so Were you part of the committee since the beginning that, since you started? Have you always been involved?
No. So I joined the committee in 1996. 1996, really? Yeah, something like that. Yeah. And I was on it for a while. And then I was off it as a student. Then I was off it like for a minute and a half. And then I went back on it. So at first I was treasurer because I could do and like doing maths. And so you can be treasurer. So I was treasurer. And then I left briefly, I think, during my pregnancy. And then I went back, and then I was on it till about 2010. And then I left again till about 2018. And then I joined again. But I've always gone to the conferences. I've always been a member of the section. I went back 2018. 2018. Yes, and then So then the next year I became chair-elect, and then chair, and now I'm past chair this year.
Yeah. And so how do you think that kind of involvement with POWES has been kind of important to you and your work, or impacted you and your work in any way?
Well, it's been my academic home. There's no question about that. I do have other kind of groups of academics that I work with in different kind of contexts, but POWES has always been my academic home. And I think I have a real sense of that's where I go when I have a new idea paper. That's where I go when I have some new data, and that's whose opinion I want to hear. That's the people I kind of connect with. There's a shared vision. I remember Brexit was in June. Do you remember the Brexit?
Yeah.
Referendum was in June. Of course, you remember it. The Brexit referendum in June, and I just remember it felt like just a cloud had come over everything. And there was and there were racist attacks all over the place, and not just racist, ethnocentric attacks. They were throwing rocks at like Canadian restaurants. Like my friend who's Australian was getting abused on the bus, being told to go home. So but it was much, much worse. So lots of my friends who are people of color were getting abused in car parks outside of Tesco, something that was not part of their normal experience. It really, I don't think it's too controversial to say that it really seemed to kind of open up the doors for some really what I consider objectionable behavior in terms, again, of othering, and that concept, that notion of othering. So that was awful. It was awful, and that whole time was awful. And I remember going to the pub with some friends that night, and we're just going, "Oh, this is awful." And then I went to POWES, which was about a month later. And I remember for the first time just arriving there, seeing people, and just feeling that cloud lift, like literally that cloud that I'd been feeling around the whole kind of Brexit and the doom, just completely lift, because I was with all these people who I really felt of mind with, being kind of on the same page with, but also people that I felt are the kind of people who get things done, who work with things, who will move. They won't just sit in their kitchen and have their ideas. They'll kind of, do something about it, small or large, but, or out there in the world doing stuff to make the world better. Naive as that may sound.
No, that's lovely. That's a lovely kind of sentiment. And I suppose that kind of brings us into kind of activism and all that sort of thing. And are you involved with, or have you been involved with, feminist activism, and is POWES involved with that sort of thing as well?
Well, I think POWES members are involved with activism. There's always been an aspiration in POWES to be more involved as an organization, and we've had various attempts to involve ourselves with different things. But I think it's more of the members do that. To be fair, as POWES as a section has been curtailed from kind of activist engagement historically because of the position that the BPS took in relation to getting involved in politics. However, this may be jumping to conclusions, but I suspect the dire nature of our current political situation has meant the BPS have slightly changed their policy on that, and they're kind of they're clearly more willing to involve. So it started, from my perspective, it started out with the BPS engaging with the whole issue around austerity and mental health services, and then and all of other campaigns that it's become involved with one after the other. Their current campaign is around class, and the previous one was from poverty to flourishing. They had one around children in schools. It's called, I can't remember what it's called, Time to Play. It's like, what are the schools doing? They're not giving children any time to play. They're all about producing something. So these are very, very kind of political kind of statements, judgments in sense of the political. And as you know, because you were involved, POWES did that statement on violence against women and girls, on the suggested government policy on violence against women and girls, which was problematic and worrying in many ways. So POWES didn't get involved in that, did make a statement on that, and did it through the BPS. I mean, the BPS completely supported that. So that policy engagement is becoming much more. So historically, POWES is an active, but it's more and more it's getting involved in that kind of thing. And certainly the members have always done so, and always there's been an aspiration.
Yeah, so it's more of a shift because of the institution it's within, I suppose.
And the environment that's become much. Sometimes I think I'm just getting old, and I just think the environment is more desperate, and government was better when I was a girl. But it does feel like that things are not going for the better at the moment in terms of the wider political context. Generally, in terms of management, but in terms of feminism, and I'm not there. There are many battles yet to fight. But things have gotten better. They definitely have gotten better. They've gotten better in academia. Yeah. In terms of being taken seriously, both as feminists, but as women, and as just academia being a little bit better at understanding the position of people who come from different backgrounds to the traditional kind of academic background. They've gotten better. There's a big push towards decolonizing the curriculum at the moment. It's been better around class, or it's trying to get better around class, and an acknowledgement of how that plays out. But also, in the broader world, and certainly sexuality has, it 1970s, wasn't that homosexuality was, in the DSM as a mental illness. So, and now, we have gay marriage, and that, I would like to say, spirited by one of the founders of POWES, Sue Wilkinson and Celia Kitzinger, who got married in Canada, came to the UK and fought to have their marriage recognized. They lost that particular battle, but I think that the fight was won. I think that, that contributed to kind of the kind of understanding and acceptance of relationships of people of different genders and sexes. I don't want to say gay marriage, because marriage is just the marriage isn't gay. So, but I
get what you mean.
Yeah.
And so with those kind of changes as well, have you seen a change, do you think, in kind of feminism and psychology as a field?
Okay. Well, I was on the editorial board of Feminism and Psychology for 20 years.
Yeah.
I joined just after when I was pregnant with my child. And I remember my eldest daughter, and I remember I was quite pregnant, and I said to Sue Wilkinson, who was the editor at the time, she said, well, the meeting's on such a day. And I said, oh, well, my baby will be 5 weeks old by then. I should be fine to come. And she said, I don't know what she thought. She was thought, oh, dear Lord. She said to me, how about we just leave it? And at the time, you can just decide, given on this, at 5 weeks, I was barely getting out of the house, So that was good. So I went to the next meeting after that, when I joined Feminism and Psychology, which I think has been a monumental influence in critical feminism, in academia more broadly. I think it really picked up something and brought together a kind of way of engaging with feminism that was broader than just, can women have more promotions? Can women have, can we get more women in the boardroom? Not saying that those things aren't important. They're absolutely crucial, but more kind of criticizing and engaging with the underpinning kind of systems that maintain those kinds of inequities. And I think and FMP has really pushed qualitative work, creative work, not as much as it could, but also things, there's a special issue on decolonization. There was early in years, there was issues on sexualization. There was sexualization on sexuality. There was, so and also, there have been special issues on postgraduate work to kind of encourage that. So I think FMP is very much a part of a community, not just a journal.
Yeah.
I was having this conversation the other day with someone about, there's a lot of journals out there now. I remember Mick Billick coming to speak to us a few years ago and saying, when I started my career, I could literally read every single journal in social psychology that came out, and I could keep on top of what was going on in social psychology. Yeah. There is no way you can't do that now. There are so many journals and so many articles and so many, online, offline, and so you can't really do that. But I think feminism and psychology is more than a journal. It's it curates community in a kind of sense, or encourages community, and maybe not curates, but tries to provide a space that otherwise would not be there. I don't think it duplicates existing space, or an existing journal in any kind of way. And I think it's tried really hard over the years to internationalize as well, which has been a challenge. Academia is so Anglo-centric, and so Anglo-centric. So we've tried really hard to reach out to people from other contexts, which is also how I got involved with the project on international feminisms, the book on international feminisms in psychology, that was Alex Rutherford originally approached me about, which I still think is a great book. It's 2011, but I think it's an edited book, but it has lots of different. We always wanted to be more international than it is, but I think it's more international than most books, and it was focused on that. And I thought kind of bringing those things together was important.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you think about kind of how, I suppose, whether POWES can be international in that same way, and whether it can be, and how is?
So I think POWES is international. Interestingly, I think there's something. Is it inherent about Britain? There's something international about Britain, maybe, I don't know, but certainly POWES is acknowledged in and far beyond what you would expect given its size. And I think we do. I think we always attract international delegates. The POWES Prize almost always. I mean, often we've had quite a few international winners of the POWES Prize, the POWES FMP Prize. I mean, that's part of for postgraduate work, but even in the undergraduate one, we build communities. I mean, usually. Not always, but often the chairs will have an agenda, some kind of thing that they would like to kind of do as their as during their term as chair. And mine was the history project that we're involved in. But a few chairs, Bridget Rickett most recently, really wanted to reach out to other organizations and kind of build networks with those. And I think that's something we've always wanted to do. And reached out to do. So we do, try to build those, and they do exist. I mean, academia is probably more international than most kinds of, areas you would be in. So I